Hi, I'm Whitney Espich, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you.
Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Guadalupe Hayes Mora, and I'm the president of MIT's LBGT Alumni Association, BGLATA. And I want to welcome everyone today to our conversation that we're having about connecting communities. I also wanted to give a little more shout out to the MIT BGLATA group. If you can log onto our website and really register there to be part of the member, and you can get more upcoming events. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator today, which is Gus Burkett. Gus Burkett is the Senior Associate Dean of Diversity and Community Involvement at MIT. His work has encompassed leading different initiatives through very different colleges and universities, which have included Boston College, UNC Charlotte, and the University of Maine. Here at MIT, his work is dedicated to foster the diversity in the community within students. And he also, when he leads with the MIT LBGT services. So he's also a strong advocate for the LGBT plus communities, and we're welcome Gus to have this conversation.
Thank you, Guadalupe, for a great introduction. I am honored to introduce to you our keynote speaker, the person that's going to be leading us on this conversation, Professor Evelynn Hammonds. Professor Hammonds is the Department Chair of the History of Science and the Barbara Gutmann Rosenkrantz Professor of History of Science and African American Studies at Harvard University. Professor Hammonds' current work focuses on the intersection of scientific, medical, and sociopolitical concepts of race in the United States. She is currently completing work around a history of biological, medical, and anthropological use of racial concepts entitled The Logic of Difference, A History of Race in Science and Medicine in the United States from 1850 to 1990. She's also completing and co-editing the MIT Reader on Race and Gender in Science. Professor Hammonds was named the Sigma Chi Distinguished Lecturer from 2003 to 2005 by Sigma Chi, the Scientific Research Society. She has been a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin and a fellow in the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. In July of 2005, Professor Hammonds was named Senior Vice Provost for Faculty Development and Diversity at Harvard University. And in March of 2008, Professor Hammonds was named Dean at Harvard College. Professor Hammonds is the author of Childhood's Deadly Scourge, the campaign to control diphtheria in New York City from 1880 to 1930. She is also the co-editor of Gender and Scientific Authority, and she has published articles on the history of disease, race and science, African American feminism, African American women and the epidemic of HIV/AIDS, and analysis of gender and race in science and medicine. She is also the author of the article Gendering the Epidemic, Feminism and the Epidemic of HIV/AIDS in the United States from 1981 to 1999, which appears in the Science, Medicine, and Technology in the 20th Century, What Difference Has Feminism Made? Dr. Hammonds earned a PhD at Harvard in the Department of History of Science, an SM in Physics from MIT, a BEE in Electrical Engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology, and a BS in Physics from Spelman College. She taught at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology before going to Harvard. While at MIT, she was a founding director of the MIT Center for the Study of Diversity in Science, Technology, and Medicine. Professor Hammond has been a visiting professor at UCLA and Hampshire College. Professor Hammond, thank you for joining us today. I am honored to moderate this conversation, and without further ado, we'll get right to it.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to have an opportunity to talk to MIT alums and students and faculty and other folks, so thank you.
Thank you. It's great to have an expert such as you to guide us through a conversation on the intersection of these three important aspects of identity, which are race, LGBTQ+, and STEM. So thank you for joining us. So to get our conversation started, before I do, I encourage our audience today to, if there are any questions that come up, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If you'd like to submit your questions during the conversation, we have structured the chat so that I'll be asking a few questions. Then we'll be going to the chat to see what questions are coming up. We'll pick up a few of those questions and we'll continue the conversation. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to do that. So to get us started, we talked about these three topics that we're gonna be talking about. So how do you see these three areas being race, LGBTQ plus identity, and STEM connecting, and how has the connection among these three areas changed over time from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a really big question, Gus. I think that the answer actually has a lot to do with historical context. So if you ask me about that here in 2020, just about this particular moment, then I have one answer. But for me, I look back toward the time when I first arrived at MIT, which was in 1976. And in 1976, there's no gay marriage. There's no even, acknowledgement of partnerships. There's no the women's movement was very, very prominent and strong in the Boston area, as well as the gay rights movement, as well as, and subsequently, activism around HIV/AIDS. So all of those things were places where, as a graduate student at MIT, I could find places where my interest in exploring my identity in terms of LGBTQ issues that's where I was spending my time outside of the lab. And of course, anybody at MIT knows you spend a lot of time in the lab. And so, but it didn't really have a kind of, those activities didn't really have a kind of place within MIT necessarily. It was right around the time I think women's studies had become a program by the time I was a graduate student for sure. And we certainly had the Black student groups and the BGSA, I think, the Black Graduate Student Association. There were very few African-American faculty at the time. And so it was a very different moment. So I think the most public profile I would have was as an African-American woman. And I will say this, so I was recruited to MIT by Shirley Jackson, who was the first African-American woman to get a PhD in physics in the US, and one of the first. And that's why I came to MIT. I thought, why would I go anywhere else? This is the place where you want to be a Black woman physicist. This is where you should come. And so I spent a lot of time with people walking up to me saying, hey, Shirley, how are you doing? And as anybody knows, we look nothing alike. And so it was the racial issues that were prominent. At the same time, there were lots of gender issues as well. There were very few women in the physics department, faculty. There were very few women students in the physics department. So race and gender were highly salient identity issues for me during that time. It was also a moment, as I said, with respect to the women's movement. There's a lot of activity. So it was a quite fundamentally different moment than it is now. But what happens over time? What happens over time is we end up getting, here at MIT institutionally, they started providing partner benefits. And what does that mean? Benefits is a sort of, and most people outside of certain kinds of institutions don't realize what an important thing is. But if you had a partner, same-sex partner, and that person ended up in the hospital, you were not allowed to be part of the family that was allowed to see that person in the hospital. And so to get partner benefits and to get hospital privileges where you could go in and be with the person that you were partnered with was a very, very important thing. And so slowly the state of Massachusetts was taking the lead on sort of opening up various kinds of organizations in these little ways that are hugely important, like partner benefits, that you could put your partner on your insurance forms and things like that. And MIT was doing those things. It's quiet, it's not highly publicized, but it's happening. And slowly but surely, as activism was happening outside of MIT on the streets, and almost every march I was in, I always walked past MIT to go over into Boston to some kind of big march. And so there was an internal and external issue. So I think there was a lot of silence within MIT on issues of sexuality. And that is just slowly changing. But for me, I'm constantly dealing with the intersection, right? The intersection of race and gender and sexuality. And I would say by the time I completed my master's degree, by that time, MIT was much more welcoming. And then much later, my partner and I had our first commitment ceremony. This is before gay marriage was legalized. We had our first commitment ceremony at the MIT Endicott House. And when we called to say, was this a venue where you could have a commitment ceremony? And they said, no, this is just for community events. But then President Vest, I asked him about that, and he said to them, this is a community event. So we had our commitment ceremony at the Endicott House. And those of you who've been there, sort of a conference center kind of place that was left to MIT, beautiful grounds, and a place where you could have those kinds of events. So by that time, and that was about probably maybe 10 years later, things had changed profoundly. And so I think being open about one's sexuality at MIT had changed internally in slowly little ways, but being pushed at the same time for what was happening outside the doors. And so I think that's the experience I had. In terms of work, MIT is a funny place. You know, if you show that you can do the work and you're doing it, sometimes there's a lot of people who don't care about the rest of your life. They just don't care. And so I never really felt any, I honestly have to say, in terms of my sexuality, I never really felt kind of direct personal barriers. I thought those came with the really structural and institutional barriers around race and gender were much more salient at that moment of time.
Thank you. And what a powerful statement when the President West, I think you mentioned, affirmed your relationship and made it known that it was considered a public event, a community event. Mm-hmm. So that's sticking with me. Thank you for sharing that. So as we're talking about race and the LGBT community particularly, I was wondering if you can identify if there are any issues of race, specifically with the Black community, that uniquely intersect with the LGBT community as well.
So I think there's very powerful pressures within science, technology, engineering, in STEM disciplines for a kind of where identity issues push toward a kind of homogeneity. One of the things my son refers to me as, and I refer to myself sometimes as a blurred, that's a Black nerd. But nerd has a particular kind of connotation. If you're at MIT, you get it. MIT is where nerds rule, right? And so a particular kind of interest, commitment, passion about STEM work, you know, is part of it. And the culture has various other aspects. I can remember the first time a woman gave a talk in the MIT physics department at their Thursday colloquium, and she wore a t-shirt and jeans. It was the talk of the department. But guys who gave their talks in t-shirts and jeans every week for years and years. And so that just crystallized that some aspects of gender were problematic in that culture, in the physics department, for sure. But as soon as a very smart young woman who was assistant professor somewhere else, she wasn't at MIT, shows up in the uniform of the day, which was a t-shirt and jeans, then all of a sudden gender just roared its ugly head, and people did not talk about what she was discussing. They talked about, oh my gosh, she had on a t-shirt and jeans. And that was just one of those flashpoints that said people are more comfortable with a kind of homogeneity in these fields, but it was hard for, even if women put on the uniform, they were still seen as women putting on the uniform. And that it made the whole room, I think it was 26,100, the whole room was uncomfortable.
Wow.
And I think had someone, just think about it in terms of, with respect to LGBTQ, I think if someone had come in and been displayed particular kinds of stereotypical mannerisms of a gay person,
whatever that is, right?
would have been equally as disruptive of the culture. So that's where I learned that there is something happening here in this culture of science and engineering. Supposedly, one's individual identity is not supposed to have any purchase, right? In doing scientific work. It's just how smart you are. Can you do the work? Do you get the work done? Do you have things to say about the work? But yet, in those flashpoint moments, you find out, yes, it does matter. And I think it still matters. And I think these fields are still struggling with allowing people to have a broad expression of identity that does not feel disruptive of communities in STEM. And women still feel disruptive. So there was an incident where a very famous Spanish astrophysicist, female, came to lead a talk at one of the meetings of that field. And many people knew she was a woman, but they didn't realize, many people had not seen her. She came, she was dressed in very, I guess the only terms to use, very highly feminine dress, high heel shoes, lots of makeup. And and some of the men in the audience were absolutely appalled. She was one of the leading astrophysicists in Spain. And in Europe, there was a lot more fluidity for women scientists to occupy, to have different kinds of presentations than there was in the US, actually. So it's only in those moments that you begin to see those kind of fault lines. And on a day-to-day basis, it's very hard to see. So I was privileged to see all those things, and I thought, that's one of the reasons I went into history of science. I really wanted to understand gender in science. So why does gender matter, and how does it matter, and how is it reflected in the communities? And as well, how does that affect young people coming in who both want to do their science, but also want to have the rest of their lives?
Those are very, very good points. Do you feel that some of the environments that you described, the classrooms, the labs, particularly for in terms of race and LGBTQ identities, are microcosms in some ways of what's going on nationally and the conversations that are taking place?
In some respects, I think STEM fields are different. I think if you mean the national conversations right now about, in particularly maybe about race, I think the STEM fields are probably decades behind many other fields, but I'm heartened by the fact that there's been articles in many of the major scientific journals, Nature, I think Science, I think, what am I thinking? Maybe New England Journal, where scientists of color are beginning to speak out quite forcefully in the last few months about the systemic racism that they've encountered in their careers trying to be scientists. In fact, there was one in Nature, I think this was an African-American woman scientist who's chair of her department, and she just talked about what her career had been like and the kinds of comments that she's gotten over the years and barriers that she's encountered. This had been a lot quieter. As a historian of science, there's not a lot of instances where numbers of scientists of color have been very outspoken about the community, the cultures in the communities of scientists that they work in. But now it's coming out, and I think that's connected to the larger discussions about race that we're having in the country right now, this moment of racial reckoning.
Absolutely. Thank you. I have this may be a longer question, so I may have to break it up into a few. But initiatives like Data for Black Lives seeks to use data science to create concrete and measurable change in the lives of Black people by fighting bias, building progressive movements, and promoting civic engagement. How do you see initiatives like this impacting Black communities? And is there a need for initiatives similar to this for the LGBTQ plus community?
Well, I think these kinds of initiatives are wonderful because it allows people who identify with the values and the interests of these groups to have a place to do what they'd like to do. When I was a student at MIT, my friends and I used to talk a lot about, what kind of work could we do that would be a benefit to our community? Why did we have to accept that the critical problems in engineering, civil engineering, for example, had to do with understanding how to build better bridges? Why wasn't it a critical problem to understand how to build better low-income housing? Energy sustainable low-income housing? Why isn't it better? Why are the problems constituted around the problems that we had experienced in our own communities rather than outside of our communities, right? And when were we as scientists and engineers of color going to have the opportunity to set a research agenda that would help us address those problems and those issues? And I think in terms of LGBTQ issues, I think that the AIDS epidemic was a space where that was a challenge. There was a challenge by people on the ground. There was a challenge to how clinical trials were run. There was a challenge to, health education, communication issues. There's a challenge to, where testing sites would be most efficacious and most available to the people who needed it. There was a challenge to how do you get a community that's disparate, diverse, to buy into a notion of safer sex, that is preserve a value of certain kinds of sexual expression, but also be concerned about sex, about safety in the wake of a deadly virus, right? A deadly epidemic. And so I think that those are two examples where, one might look back at one's, bringing one's scientific related, technical related interests to different sets of problems. Mm-hmm. The challenges, the normative problems, the research agendas that we had to, and we were studying, that we had to learn how to master, right? So I think we have good examples now of that kind of work. And I certainly, many of the historical studies that look at what happened when HIV was so prevalent, show the ways in which people were doing that. There were a lot of physicians who were gay, who turned their attention to doing research on HIV. There were folks who were activists who were turned their attention to it. So, I think Guadalupe, who's on the board of the Fenway? I think somebody was on the board.
I am.
Yes, so the Fenway Community Health Center was a leader in some of these kinds of issues. And that was about bringing one's work with one's identity in a way that hadn't happened before. And I think we're going to find that more and more with people of color in STEM, to bring their own perspective to setting a research agenda to solve the kinds of problems that we feel are necessary to be solved at this point in time for communities that we care about. Not that we don't care about the larger community, but there's stuff that's been there. Just take Flint, Michigan, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of people have wanted to put their energy into understanding how in the 21st century, a community like Flint could have the kinds of problems with water, classic engineering problem, that they had. And they've come, and innovative things have happened as a result. And I think lots of students of color have been interested in that. I've always said about MIT is close to public housing projects in Cambridge. And I've always said, what kind of problems do they have? And why aren't we working on any of them? As part of why we get homework assignments about how do we make better heating ventilation systems that might work better in those buildings for people who can't afford individual window air conditioners. Can we do better than that? Can we do this differently?
Great questions. Thank you. And you mentioned epidemics and moments of crisis in our history that helped us think forward about solutions. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what you think some of the results of this COVID pandemic might be. I feel the pandemic has highlighted structural inequalities around schooling. You mentioned housing, healthcare, unemployment, and particularly for some of the communities that we're talking about in terms of race and identities, they've really highlighted the difference between communities and the boundaries that are among these communities. So do you feel that this pandemic data that's been generated and the highlight on these communities will be long lasting, and will these inequalities be addressed, or is this something that ends here?
Well, that's a question. And now my hat as a historian, it's not a predictive science, I can't tell you. But it is, so pandemics don't produce inequalities, they reveal inequalities. And now that they have been made visible, we have an opportunity to deal with them. We need to think about the fact that so many people's healthcare is tied to their employment in a moment when so many people lost their employment and they lost their healthcare. Is that the right way to do this? We need to talk about actually the other day, and I hadn't really thought this through, but I'll just say it. I think many of our school buildings, for example, at one moment I thought I'd be a civil engineer. And I was very interested in the built environment and how you could do things differently. For some reason, all of that questioning that I had during that time is coming back to me. We hadn't thought about how to build school buildings differently in a very long time, it seems. A lot of pictures that I see on TV of school buildings that are very old. And you might say, is this the way we need to have school buildings? If we had done it differently or started thinking about it, might it have been possible for students to go back to school, and there would be lots of, HEPA filters in ventilation systems, so it's possible to recirculate the air in a much more efficient way that would have not let the virus be, in the environment and cause disease. These are questions that I think this moment, as it has revealed all these different kinds of things that we need to think about, but were not visible, that now are visible, it's our moment to start fixing them. It's our moment to start fixing them. And I hope that we see the need to do that, right? Because otherwise, will it take another pandemic for us to recognize and address things that we need to deal with? It's hard to say. It's an inflection point. It's an inflection point.
Absolutely. And perhaps we have a question that came in through the Q&A that relates a little bit to what you're talking about. It takes you to the next level of action. So the question is, can you talk about how elite universities or institutions like Harvard could better support LGBTQ plus students, particularly in years like this year when we're dealing with a crisis?
I'm sorry, say the last part again.
Yes, can you talk to us a little bit about how elite universities like Harvard could better support LGBTQ plus students in years like the year that we're facing now?
So I think one of the key things has to be, as many students are having to remain at home. Now, imagine this scenario. You're a freshman, you came out at Christmas or the holiday season, and it didn't go well. You went back to school, and in spring, you had to leave school and go back home. And you hadn't figured out how you were going to relate to your family hadn't figured out how you were going to relate to you, but you have to go back home. That's the only place you have to go. I think this is a really moment where institutions have to be mindful that those kinds of situations exist, and that you have to, and they have to provide support for students who find themselves in those circumstances. Our homes have not really been designed to be the sites of education in the ways that people are being asked to do right now. It's putting a lot of stress on families. It's putting a lot of stress on students. And of course, there's a deeper disappointment. You thought, as a freshman, you finally got your independence. And then we've had this retrenchment and this difficult time. So I think the institutions educational institutions don't typically like to be involved in those parts of the family life, right? You bring them to the campus so you can deal with them there. So I think that we have to, it's a shift for all of us to try to figure out how to be supportive and help students work through issues that could be quite challenging in this particular time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have another question from our audience. You mentioned the critical role of mentors in your own trajectory. You mentioned Shirley Jackson. How do you see your own role as a mentor? And do you have any advice for those of us in the queer people of color community who are moving into positions where we may serve in a similar role?
Well, I think mentoring is just absolutely critical. I don't even know how many mentors I have, but they all form a circle around me that I depend on all the time and have for many, many years. One of the sad things in this pandemic, I lost one of my former teachers, and it was a big loss for me. So I think being a mentor is just a way, I think it's just part of being an educator, that you have to be constantly, and one of the best parts of being an educator is being constantly involved in producing the next generation, for me, next generation of scholars, but also to be engaged with young people who maybe don't want to do what I do, excuse me, but who I can offer some ways to help them think about how they can achieve whatever goals that they actually have. I think a mentor-mentee relationship is one where the mentor gets as much out of it as the mentee does. And I think it's critical for, especially for LGBTQ students, for students of color who still our educational institutions are not diverse enough. There are not enough people who can do this work and make those connections for them. And so it's an obligation that I think we all have as faculty. I certainly feel that way.
Thank you. And perhaps mentorship, it's one of the answers to the next question, but do you see, or are there any specific or even unique strategies that the LGBTQ plus community can take to support Black lives and communities of color to help ensure that the queer people of color are not being left out of many of the national conversations that are going on right now?
I don't know how much we can impact the national conversation in direct ways. I think we do it indirectly. I'm very much a proponent of, you do your work where you are. So I think if in the organizations that you're embedded in, institutions you're embedded in, if you do your work there, that is the route to impacting the national conversation. And, I mean, I think one of the things sometimes I think about graduate students of color and graduate students who are LGBTQ and the intersection of those. One of the things I say, graduate school can be pretty isolated. You could get all deep into your work and you're in your lane and and it's piles and piles of work and you got to spend a lot of time on it. Sometimes you need to come up for air, but maybe when you come up for air, you go and do something for somebody else. You tutor, you get involved in activist programs or things around you in your town, in your city, nationally, whatever, in your field. And that expands your horizon from just focus on, I've only got 10 pages of my chapter done and I've got to have this done by the end of the term. I mean, I think that's what I always say to people: get out of your house, get out of the library and go and do something for somebody else. And I think that's just my own perspective, because for me, being engaged in activities outside of physics, outside of engineering, outside of history or science even, were important activities that made me feel like I was making a certain kind of contribution at the time.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience, and the question is, you mentioned that scientists should be able to express multiple aspects of their identity without being disruptive to the culture of their fields. Though, couldn't one argue that a certain amount of disruption is necessary for bringing about cultural change? How can one balance being true to oneself without having to completely dismantle the culture of the field?
Oh, completely disrupting the culture of a field is really, really hard work and takes a really long time. But I didn't mean that one should avoid that work. It's just how you decide to do it. And it also determines, it's also about when you can do it. As a student, there's certain things you could do and you can be involved in raising questions. As an assistant professor, there's certain things you can do. But there are limitations there, because partly until you have tenure and you have a real voice in the field, it's very hard to do certain kinds of things. And then but you should be focused on what you can do at each step of the way. and clear about that. It's a long game. It's a long game to change cultures, excuse me, and communities. And so I think you have to be committed to that, and you have to be committed to doing the best work that you can do on your terms and the terms of your field. And then at the other hand, by the time you are at the point of tenure where you can pretty much have a lot more freedom, then you do other kinds of things. And so it's just not an easy process. It's a long and complicated process. And the biggest issue about it is the one has to make that commitment to doing that work.
Thank you. I have another question for you. How do we talk about and directly confront white supremacy within the communities that we're talking about? So in the communities of color, in the LGBTQ+ community, and particularly in STEM?
Well, I think that's another one of those big questions, right?
Sorry.
But I think confronting white supremacy is about, one, you have to, I'll put it this way. First, you have to educate yourself about white supremacy. And as a historian, I'm very much encourage people to do a fair amount of reading. And then you have to think about how it manifests itself in the field. And I'm so sorry, I'm beginning to lose a little bit of my voice. How it manifests itself in the places where you are. And then the other part is learning how to make allies, and learning how to be, when it's time to call things out. And that's a step that's sometimes very difficult to do. But if you're committed to the deep institutional systemic change that is represented by institutions that have not challenged white supremacy, then you have to be prepared to take some risks sometime that some people might not think are reasonable risk. And to make this less abstract, when I was an assistant professor at MIT, is when my colleague, Robin Kilson, and I had the first Black Women in the Academy conference. It was in 1894. It was in 1994. Robin and I were untenured professors. We decided we hatched this idea of having a conference about what was happening for Black women in the academy. And we thought we'd probably have, I don't know, a couple hundred people come to MIT in January. What were we thinking? And it turned out to be the largest gathering of African-American women in the history of the American Academy. Over 2,000 people came. Never had happened. And people were like, what's happening at MIT? Having a conference on Black women in the academy. And we had keynote speakers were Angela Davis, Lonnie Guinier, who had just been turned down for a position in the Clinton Department of Justice, and Janetta Cole was president of Spelman College. And it was not just, it wasn't for Black women, it was for Black women, but it was for women in the academy. So it was a very diverse group of people who came. And we had a lot of support around the country. We had support from the Mellon Foundation and from Microsoft and and President Vest was present in the opening ceremony about the meaning of having such an event at MIT. Now, a lot of people said to us then and would say later, that's a very risky thing for two untenured people to do. Because it was political, because it was about race, it was about gender and sexuality, all kinds of things. But for many people who had to evaluate us, it wasn't scholarship. Right? It's not a book, it's not a peer-reviewed article. It's a conference, and a big, incredible conference on the front page of Chronicle of Higher Education. Okay. That was a challenge to the institutional climate of MIT and to the academy in general. And we did it. It was great. We got the best publicity. We changed, I mean, young people who came, young graduate students who came, I still meet them and say, you couldn't possibly know me, but I was at that meeting. Of course, I couldn't see 2,500 people. I don't know who was there, except for my friends. But yeah, it made a difference in the world. It was a very important intervention in making visible the role of Black women in the American Academy. And so, you know, it was a risk. And it meant the next week, the two of us had to get back to work on our books and work on our tenure cases, which we did.
Yeah. Thank you. And perhaps what you just mentioned will serve as a good example for my next question, but I was wondering if you have seen any examples in which the conversations at the intersection of race, LGBTQ plus identity, and STEM have been productive, and if so, what did they look like?
I think I've seen more conversations that have been productive at the intersection of race and gender at this point. I actually gave a talk several years ago for the LGBTQ affinity group at the National Science Foundation. And that was a very interesting moment for me because that group of program officers, people who set up review panels to review applications for funding, people who are, and some of those are rotating positions where they leave their universities and work at NSF for 2 years or so and then go back. So it's connected to the academy, but also separate in that particular time. And so they were trying to find ways to make identity issues of all kinds visible, but particularly LGBTQ. And it's a very difficult thing to do in STEM, in part because identity is not supposed to be a predictive value of doing the work, right? But yet the culture sometimes makes it difficult for people who are open about their identities to feel comfortable enough and focused enough to do their work. If the community is hostile, then they can't do their work. And what does that mean? And how does an institution like National Science Foundation actually recognize that and find a way to hold the broad community that they fund accountable for that? And so they needed to go through a process of rethinking evaluations. And part of it, I think, is still an ongoing process. I think part of that process is for them to say, look, we're not gonna, if somebody's gonna write a review and throw in an ad hominem attack of some kind or make some unnecessary comment about someone's work that has to do with identity, that's not gonna get counted. And let's just make that a rule. Mm-hmm. And not just act like it didn't happen. Right. And try to understand how the peer review process can be shaped by particular perceptions of race and gender and sexuality. And for example, somebody might say, gender is probably one that comes to mind most easily. Oh, this person, she's had 3 kids in 5 years. And so her productivity is questionable and she shouldn't get NSF funding. NSF program officers had to learn how to say, that's not acceptable. Is the work she's produced in the years when she was doing her work good work? If so, by a set of metrics, then the fact that she has less than a guy who had 3 kids in the same amount of time, but did not spend time with the 3 kids at the same amount of time, is not penalized for that. So we're not gonna, if we ignore parenting issues for men, we ignore parenting issues for women, right? So they have to learn how to think through biases that were probably built into peer review, and they're still in that process of trying to understand it. And so I think the larger question is, it's not easy to talk about one's gender or sexuality in the presentation of one's work. So for example, so what I did, my master's degree is about an X-ray scattering study of xenon physiabsorbed on graphite. Just think about it for a minute. And so what does my being a Black woman, feminist, lesbian have to do with anything with that? Not much, right? Right. Unless somebody wants to make it an issue, right? So it doesn't go into the work that way. It goes into how one is accepted in the community as being a valued contributor and respected. And if there's going to be some sort of dismissive behavior about my presentation on xenon physiabsorbed on graphite, then it was probably going to be about my race or my gender or my sexuality or whatever. Then that's the part where leaders have to say, no, we're not doing that. We're just not doing that. That's not how we deal with people. We need to talk about xenon and graphite. We need to talk about melting and phase transitions. We are not here to talk about this person's, see this person as a not valid and valued contributor to the discussions about phase transitions and two-dimensional systems.
And in your opinion, do those conversations stop there, or once someone... Let me
interrupt you for a second. And here's the deal. Not a whole lot of people want to know about phase transitions and two-dimensional systems.
So when you said we just stop it there and we're not going to go into talking about this, is there also room for a follow-up conversation with those folks that are making it about race and identity, to then have a follow-up and confront those conversations that we couldn't have right now, but that they need to take place? Absolutely.
Absolutely. I was on a panel at the American Physical Society probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago now. It was the first time there was a panel of all African-American women. And the leaders of the American Physical Society thought this was a good idea, and they gave us a big ballroom and heavily advertised it, and very few people came. And that's interesting to me, why they didn't come. It says there's still a problem, right? They didn't think there was anything we had to say that they needed to hear. We weren't talking about phase transitions in two-dimensional systems. And so I think that says that, remember, we still have to always understand that those STEM fields are about the work. They also are about culture and communities, and the production of knowledge comes out of the culture and the communities. They're not separated from it.
Thank you. And we may have time for 2 more questions, but I'm going to jump to my last question because I really want to get this one in.
I could talk.
Good. So hopefully you have a little bit more for just this one at least. So, and you mentioned a little bit of this in your last question. In your own career, have you encountered situations driven by implicit bias, or when you had to handle microaggressions from peers and colleagues? And how have you learned to deal with this type of interactions?
Oh, Gus, microaggressions were nothing. Big aggressions were
they were micro.
They're not even macro. We're talking about a time when I was coming through engineering school at Georgia Tech and MIT, where people would just say, "You don't belong. Why are you here?" And there are many times when I would be sitting in building 13 in the office next to my lab, and people would walk by and say, could you make sure that my office gets clean tonight? And I'm like, what? No. What do you mean no? And because I have nothing to do with getting offices cleaned. They thought I was why would a janitor be sitting in an office with other graduate students? I didn't even understand how they were thinking, but they saw me and they thought I was somebody cleaning up the building or something. So we're talking major aggressions. We're not talking just, people misspeaking or something. No, there were people who made it very clear. There were people who made it very clear in some of my classes that, I don't know why you think you can be a physicist. Black people can't do physics. Black people can't do science. And they were very vocal, very clear, very adamant about and very wedded to their opinions. So, but what you have to do, seriously, you have to develop a tough skin. You have to fight back. You have to make it clear that people are not allowed to say those kinds of things to you and make those kinds of assumptions about who you are and who belongs, and nobody made them in charge of anything. There was a case where, when I was at MIT, of a postdoc who brought a bunch of graduate students into the faculty, what used to be a faculty dining room. And the postdocs were allowed to do that. And she was African American. And there was another faculty member from a different department who said to her, "What are you doing bringing people into this dining hall? You don't know the rules." And she said, "Yes, I do know the rules. And I'm bringing people from our lab in to have lunch together." And he was like, "No, you're not allowed to do it." He was not the manager or in charge of the faculty dining room, but he made it very clear to her that she could not. It turns out, as I said, she was a postdoc. She was allowed to do it. He was told that he had to apologize. He refused and said that how could he possibly know that she was a postdoc? Well, he couldn't assume. He never questioned. He wasn't standing there questioning every white man who walked through there about their faculty status or not or whatever. But he was allowed to do that. And so the harm here was huge because it was so embarrassing to her that she felt like that she could not stay at this institution. And she went to another institution. You have to learn how to, and I talked to her and I was like, don't give up, don't give up. We can fight back. It's gonna be fixed. We're gonna make sure he can't come and eat in the faculty dining room for a while. He's the one who's gonna get punished. But it's very difficult to confront it. And there were days when I felt like I was putting on a t-shirt, but actually I was putting on my armor. And you have to have friends, you have to have support, and you have to build allies, and you have to realize that that being treated as a valued member of STEM communities takes a lot of hard work. And that if you have the passion to do the work and care about the work that you're engaged in, then you can find a way through it. But you have to build support for yourself in order to do it.
Yeah, what's interesting, and I think Guadalupe just sent me a message, or Moana did. I believe the faculty room you're speaking about, the faculty dining room, it's now at MIT, the Rainbow Lounge. So it's funny how these things have a way to work their way around, right? So I want to go back, and this is the last question, I promise. You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation today, when we were talking about rights and we were talking about same-sex marriage and so on, you said that you were glad. I'm not sure how you worded it, but I took in my notes that you were happy to see Massachusetts take the lead, and that MIT had taken the lead in some ways as well. Considering that historical perspective, what do you see as the top agenda items that MIT and Massachusetts should be taking the lead on in the reality that we're living in today?
I would say that the most important thing for right now is we can't lose ground. There's a lot of resistance to all the advances that we've made, the progress we've made. We cannot be naive and we can't lose ground. We still have to stand our ground and hold on to what the progress that we've made. And there are people who don't like the fact that we've made progress. And so I think MIT as an institution has to hold the ground, the state, and all the people who I think believe that believe what we say in our Constitution to build a more perfect union. We've been building a more perfect union. We've been expanding the franchise. We've been building a more expansive democracy, and we have to hold on to those expansions right now. And every institution has to be engaged in that, from my perspective. It's a moment of where some things are at risk. And so it's important for leadership of an institution like MIT to be aware of the risk, and I think the leadership is. And I think we should not be retreating from the things that we have accomplished.
Thank you. So Professor Hammonds, I think this is the end of our time, but I want to offer you my most sincere thank you for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us today, your experiences. I think this is the beginning of many conversations that we need to be having about the intersection of all these different identities that MIT is uniquely positioned to have conversations about. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you to the MIT Alumni Association for hosting this event, and for BGLATA as well for giving us the opportunity to have this conversation. Thank you to the audience for attending tonight.
Thank you, Gus. I really enjoyed it. And
thank you very much.
To make it possible.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.